Are we on air? Are we live?
We are.
I'm going to make the assumption that we are.
Yeah,
Well,
as far as I can tell.
brilliant. Welcome, everyone. You are listening to Trinity FM. We're a show called We Lads, Big Problems. And today, first of all, I'm your host, Ryan O'Connor. I'm a Donegal lad. I like things such as eating and sleeping. Many interests, a man of many, many interests. That's all you need to know about me. I'm very talented. That's all. Today I'm joined by three lovely co-hosts. We have Evan Karen Key. Would you like to introduce yourself?
No.
Fair. We have Ellen Kenny.
Hi, I'm Ellen. My political ideology is Libra.
And we have Oisin Brown.
Hi, and I don't understand what Ellen just said.
Fair enough. That probably will be the theme of the show, just us not understanding what each other said because we talk complete shite. Well, anyway, we're a completely innovative show. It's a show where four white people talk about their political problems and give their opinions on them. It's never been done before. We do believe that our opinions need to be heard. And today we'll be talking about the situation today with regards to democracy in Africa. We'll be talking about whether or not democracy is inherently a good thing. I think everyone has a very similar opinion on that. But it's really come down to economic development in Africa through democracy and the impact that democracy has on economic development. Right. Will we just get it started? Does anyone else want to say anything before we start? I'll take. Go.
Oh, nothing in particular. No, I was just about to start. So, where are we starting then with the discussion, or how is it looking?
Right. Well, we'll start off with Let me get the doc up real quick.
Prepared as ever.
Does anyone want to go into prepared as ever? I'm always prepared. You know
Democracy
me.
began with the doc.
Democracy began with Google Docs, actually. Yeah. What's the current situation in Africa with regards to democracy? Evan, do you want to do a quick summary of maybe the Economist article on the situation in Uganda at the minute?
Yeah. So, situation in Uganda. Right. Let me pull up the docs as well. I'm almost as prepared as Ryan. Right. So, essentially, what we're looking at in Uganda is in 1986, there was a turn of government and kind of a coup in Uganda, and essentially a democratic government was installed. It was applauded by Western governments for bringing peace, holding elections, liberalising the economy, promising free speech, things like that. There was this big thing made about this fella Museveni, 100% pronouncing that wrong. That he was the kind of leader that could admit his mistakes. He was honest. He was a good leader, right? Now that was 1986. 35 years later, he's still in office, which possibly isn't as much a good thing as it might have been back then. His whole outlook has changed, and the presentation's changed. Uganda's become a dictatorship. Clearly, in the article they describe him as, instead of being that kind of candid and honest dealer that he was before, he's more of a thin-skinned autocrat. He takes insult to things. He's locks media and locks journalists up, puts them in prison, that kind of thing. And at the minute, there's an election going on, and Bobby Wine, who's he's a pop singer and an activist, has been recently put in jail by the government for kind of trumped up charges. Nothing. He didn't do anything wrong apart from go against the regime. So the issue that the particular issue that the Economist article really goes on about is the term limits and how they're being disrespected in these in so many of these by so many leaders across Africa. and there's been a backsliding of democracy. But I suppose, Ryan, if you want to go on about the questions we want to ask about that now, and how we're going to look at. Again, I think we're going to take a wider approach to it, isn't it? That like instead of just looking at like these particular instances, again, a more wider view about like the history of democracy in Africa and where it's going to go, and what hopefully if there's anything we can do about it, or if there's any policies or anything that should be done, we're going to have a look at what's the story there.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like we'll be trying to take a wider approach, as Evan says. We'll really start off. Well, actually, I'll start off by saying that I think Uganda is probably, after doing a wee bit of Google searching, it seems to be a good representative of many African countries that do not currently have democratic systems. Many of them seem to be falling into the same traps as Uganda is, and it does seem that in democracy, the lack of democracy is inherently a bad thing. Alan, do you want to chat any more about? Hold on, I should have done a lot. I should have done better questions. I'm unprepared. But Alan, what do you think democracy is inherently linked to economic, improvements? Do you think that we should focus on democracy when it comes to developing or economically developing African countries?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time, like a lot of papers and scholars make it sound like there's this choice between economic development and democracy, as if you have to pick either people can vote or people can eat. But I don't think there is like this harsh line you have to draw between them. And I think more they play into each other more, that if you want proper democracy, you do need obviously good development. Like you need people who are healthy enough to vote and are healthy enough to take part in democracy and are satisfied with the society they live in. But also if you want proper development in a society, there needs to be some sort of collaboration. Like you were saying earlier, like I know you said before that you can't eat choice, but I suppose you can choose like what you eat. You can choose that you can like choose the makeup of the society you live in. You can choose your representatives who will decide things for you. So I don't think we need to choose between democracy and development. I think they should exist together.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that democracy is essential to economic development? Do you think they go hand in hand,
Yeah, I think democracy is essential to development because it puts more control in the people who will be reaping the benefits of development. It's not just that there's this omnipotent leader or like all this power concentrating in one person or a small group who decide everything for the rest of the population. I think it's better to have some form of democracy and some form of representation in that, so that the will of the people is represented in the policies of the government.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. I think representation is essential to just improvements in living conditions and all the rest, because representation and proper representation is the only way that the people have a voice, and well, it's the only way that the people who are living at the very bottom lines of the country have any sort of voice. And Oisin, would you like to chat about what type of political institutions we could look at? African countries could look at implementing maybe like longer terms or shorter terms, even presidential terms, and independent courts, all the rest. Do you want to chat a bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's very important, of course, as we said earlier, that there's a form of democracy, this form of representative leadership in Africa, the same way that we aspire to have that in the West, albeit to varying degrees. And of course, not every political system is going to take the same shape as another, and that's fair. But we also have to be very careful not to project maybe our exact wishes onto African states. The cultural values, the societal values that African people possess. Although we also have to be careful not to look at Africa as a whole, because it's an extremely diverse continent. Not everyone in Ireland has the same views as someone in Poland, and I don't think anyone should maybe try and force feed that as a some sort of preconception. The types of institutions maybe that that could exist in Africa could take from the types of leadership that existed in Africa before the continent was colonized by Europe in pre-colonial African societies such as the Igbo in Nigeria, the Yoruba across West Africa, and Ashanti Ghana. They all had cultural democracies where decision making was based on consensus. The Yoruba tradition, in particular, had very strong representative decision making, having more decentralized structure of representation. These sort of structures, they consisted of autonomous subunits, high levels of involvement, high moral standards of leadership, leadership training and accountability. All of these things were much more common in cultural democracies that had existed in Africa before colonization, and perhaps are to a certain extent more representative than what we have in many Western liberal democracies today. And of course, it isn't. It may not necessarily be possible to exactly replicate these sort of structures again, because democracy is less effective generally everywhere now than it was hundreds of years ago. Even though we may have more integrity in our structures, because there's population growth makes democracy ineffective. If you have if we look at, say, like Albert Bartlett's theory on population growth, that say, like in I think he said Boulder in Colorado, that 50 years ago, 100 years ago, they had 9 people on the city council and they had 10,000 in their city population, and now they have 200,000 in the city population. They still have 9 people on the city council. Things like that makes democracy has to be more malleable and has to be more modernized, but taking inspiration from the systems that have already existed in Africa for hundreds of years, and in many ways were far more advanced than what we had in the time at the time in Europe and in the United States. Taking inspiration from their own past could be the most effective way to bringing integrity and representation back into leadership in Africa, I feel.
That was very informative, I have to say. Oisin has come a lot more prepared than the rest of us. Really, what I want to ask, I think we've established democracy is essential to economic growth in many African countries that have very high, really worryingly high poverty rates. But what I want to ask is the West using the lack of democracy in Africa, in many African countries, as almost a scapegoat? Because this is what when I'm reading a lot of that Washington Post article, for example, I felt like they were using the lack of democracy as a scapegoat for the role the West has played in the exploitation of African lands and people. It seems to just not even give a single mention to the role the West has played in the past with colonialism and exploiting the people, and currently to this day with corporations just exploiting the people again through horrifically low wages, just outsourcing. I don't even know where to begin on outsourcing. It seems inherently just horrible to me, and well, I suppose I'll learn in a few years' time where I really stand on that. But where was I going with this for a question to ask? I had a proper question too. Promise you, I did. Do we think the West, is using democracy or the lack of democracy in many African countries as a scapegoat? Someone can volunteer to answer this one.
Yeah. I think first of all, I want to say fair play to Oisin there, because I think we came across the same article, but he actually read it, which is fair enough. But yeah, no, what you were saying there is very interesting. It kind of ties into this in a way, in that the lack of democracy in Africa is like to a large extent like a result of the West's actions, and for the West then to say that like, oh well, the lack of development in Africa is because there's no democracy there. It's nonsensical essentially, and I think you're completely right there, Ryan, and that the idea that you can't, the idea that the West can't promote or that we can't have like proper development in Africa because there's no democracy there. So therefore, there's nothing that the West can do in that respect. It's nonsensical. It really doesn't it doesn't hold up when you put it to scrutiny. As for whether like can you consider like the West using that as an excuse, I suppose like it depends. It depends who you're talking to, because the West is a big thing. Like there is an element of all this where people say that like there's the complete just absolute racism where people say that like, oh, African countries aren't suited to democracy, and those like that can't happen there, and therefore that we can't have development because of that, which is it's racism, and it doesn't make
Yeah,
any
they love to put
sense.
like an emphasis on deep tribal.
Yeah, I remember that from the politics we did earlier in the year. Yeah, that it's very easy for Western media to put that kind of analysis on things that like, oh, the African countries are they're full of these ethnicities that are like
Savages.
always at war. So, yeah, that kind of thing. Whereas in fact, like as just what Oisin was saying about the Yoruba and all that, these countries in Africa now were created in. Most of them were like the borders were drawn in 1884 by people sitting in Berlin in order to divide the continent up in a way that was most appropriate for exploitation. And then people wonder then why it's so hard for democracy to take hold in Africa when the countries and the borders weren't designed for the development of democracy. They were designed for exploitation. So yeah.
Yeah, just to add to that, I guess the purpose of the creation of or the Berlin Conference of 1884 that you reference, despite maybe some of the failures in achieving perfect democracy and the corruption that we see in Africa, you can blame. People can try and say, well, oh well, there's these corrupt leaders, and so therefore they can't have economic development. But the I suppose the economic perks that Europe and the United States gained from the Berlin Conference, the African nations still absolutely fulfilled that their exploitation purpose. Europe still greatly benefits from it. So for all of the economic policy that could be introduced in Africa, when Europe and the United States are still exploiting the resources created on the continent of Africa, it's some of the efforts by African politicians are going to be in vain so long as Europe keeps exploiting them.
Yeah. That's like, yeah, so long as like you have this whole like philosophy behind trade as well, that like a lot of countries will see that like all trade is independent from their their treatment of human rights and their foreign policy and things like that. As long as the European countries and the America, that the countries that like in the West that have as long as any developed country essentially says that like will consider, say, things like trade deals and that kind of economic exploitation, will consider all those things separate from their foreign policy with regards to like developing democracy and supporting developing industry within the country. As long as you keep those things separate, then you're not really trying to support democracy in these countries. Like, and I know obviously that runs into problems then with sanctions and whether or not they work. But I feel like there's a lot more that could be done to develop democracy and to like essentially work, to essentially undermine autocratic leaders or to get in reforms. There's a lot more that could be done there in terms of negotiations from when the EU makes trade deals with African countries, and when the US makes trade deals. If they were really serious about going in and consolidating democracy or having even some small reforms, then they would use their bargaining power to like force those reforms. Whereas what they do is they use their bargaining power to exploit even further, and then have a rhetorical spin on it that oh well, sure, we support democracy fully in these countries.
That was just perfect. That's exactly what I was going for. I really I think Oisin brought up a really interesting point there, and that while history plays a really important role on like the worldwide divide, the poverty gap between countries, history plays an incredibly important role in that, and it is the cause. It's why things are why they are now. But I think a real emphasis in the literature now needs to be put on on developed countries and the role they play in oppressing not developed countries, third world countries. The role that Europe and the US and China plays in exploiting countries that may not be experiencing the type of democracy that the people would like, and maybe roles they have in potentially upholding autocratic regimes through trade deals and through supporting them. And I don't really know too much about that. All I know is that it happens. Alan, would you like to talk a wee bit about anyone? I'm gonna wait. Alan, you go. I'm gonna let you go.
Oh yeah, this is just all very new. This is all just really interesting information, because obviously it's important to acknowledge like the West's role in effectively aiding and installing these autocratic regimes indirectly. But then also with that, is there some responsibility then on us to revert them, and then to what extent, how much do we intervene in these countries? Because obviously the West does have a huge history of installing democracy in countries when there are ulterior motives. So I just wonder how much of a role does the West play in helping African countries install proper democracies that are fair and free?
Yeah, I think one of the things it reminds me of there is the focus on on the democratic facade that a lot of Western foreign policy ends up with this thing. I think I can't remember the countries now, but there's 4 countries in Africa that hold regular multi-party elections, but aren't considered by NGOs to be democracies at all. So I think this kind of a lot of what happens sometimes with the West going in and saying oh, this is the regime change that we want, is you end up with a facade of democracy, but the actual proper preconditions for developing an actual democracy, competitive democracy, aren't there in the first place. And also there's just to go back to, it was in that article that you were talking about there, Oisin, about the Yoruba, which is an indigenous tribe pre-colonial that was near where Nigeria is now. And one of the issues with that is that the West has essentially imposed our liberal policies and our idea of democracy and parliamentary democracy, representative democracy on these areas and on these people in Africa without any attention being paid to how these people might have lived previously, or how their culture treats hierarchy and power. And there's cases across the continent where the indigenous tribes and the way that natives live is actually more responsive and more democratic than the kind of the liberal presidential parliamentary systems that the West tends to push on African countries. So I think there's a lot of work there to be done in terms of not just intervening in support of democracy, but to figure out what kind of democracy like is necessary, and like what kind of what suits that particular situation best. So yeah, there's a lot of thought to be done there, on like how the West should intervene, where it should intervene, and how it should intervene, and the kind of thinking it should do in the first place before it does so.
Yeah, like this is the really big question for me myself now. Is that we've come to the conclusion that democracy would be a good thing for African countries that are currently experiencing incredibly high poverty rates. But we know the West's history with imperialism, and well, I said that was strange. But with imposing Western liberal values onto countries that really, have nothing to do with them. That's like forcing values onto a country. Just it can't end well. It can't result well. Like you have to let people develop. Part of me is saying you have to let people develop themselves. And another part of me is looking at the current state of many African countries and thinking, okay, well, at some point somebody's going to have to step in here. And Oisin, I just want to ask you, what role do you think? Like, does the West know best? What role do Western countries have in imposing Western values such as democracy on countries in Africa that are experiencing poverty, even behind a possible facade of wanting to help them, or even if it is just genuinely wanting to help them? Like, what role does the West play?
Well, that's the $1 million question. Of course, for people who are politically engaged and see the levels of corruption and sort of the stagnant or failing economies, but not just from in terms of GDP, because at the end of the day that isn't really representative of how people live their lives, but when the living outcomes are so terrible for people in many parts of Africa because of we've seen with Ebola outbreaks, just the high poverty rates, lack of access to water and education in certain parts. It's no one wants to just sit back and let that happen. Certainly, the people who would rather see improving living outcomes for all rather than the global north continuing to gain from the exploitation of Africa. It's difficult to try and frame, right, well, what can the West do, or certainly should we want our governments involved with Africa at all, because European leadership involved in Africa has never ended well. We can certainly attribute many of the problems that are occurring in African politics. Most of them can be attributed back to colonization. So it would be quite rich to just automatically assume that, well, the West knows best and the West can come and fix it, when in reality most of the problems that exist in Africa are caused by the West. But that's not to say that nothing can be done either. We've obviously seen NGOs are able to do great work in providing access to clean water and access to basic healthcare. And these are great things. Obviously, what the end goal is that there's no real need for the NGOs to have to provide these provisions to the people of Africa, but we all know that isn't just going to happen magically in 5 years if the West intervenes in some way. It's just not possible. I think the most important thing that we can do, we being just Western countries, whether we're talking about our leadership or just us as a whole, but primarily our leadership and our corporations, is sort out our own problems within our democracies. We have to make our systems of government as transparent and fair as possible. We've seen with again, going back to the issue of population growth in terms of how it affects climate change, we've seen when the global north have lectured in the United Nations to African countries about population growth, but yet there's still bans on abortion and contraception, or restrictive access to them in our parts of the world. So it's very rich of us to kind of point fingers, or our governments to point fingers at them and say they're a problem, when it's extreme. It's hypocrisy is what it is. I think one of the most important things for our leadership to do is to be to offer solutions in climate change, because while people in sub-Saharan parts of Africa are dealing with the worst droughts they've ever faced, that is the direct consequence of our overconsumption and our exploitation of other parts of the world. So long as we live lives of such excess, and primarily our corporations that are inefficient and exploitative, and just lead to way too much GHGs going in our air. Until we're able to deal with that, because we've seen directly in Syria and Egypt and Jordan where drought and problems in their ecosystem is leading to political conflict. Until we're able to deal with that, it's quite difficult, or it's almost in vain to suggest any other sort of solutions until we deal with our overconsumption and our inefficient ways.
Yeah, I think.
On there, Evan.
All right, no, I think definitely there's it's actually quite interesting bringing climate change into it, and the fact that that's a challenge that we face in a much smaller extent compared to African countries. But definitely, I think like the right level of intervention for developed countries is it's at neither extreme. It's the West doesn't obviously, like, the West knows best is a whole load of crap. Essentially, it's not it's not something that we can. It's not something that we can defend. We shouldn't defend. It's inherently racist. But on the other hand, to say that like the West shouldn't have any impact at all, or shouldn't intervene at all, is also it's not correct either, because like there's situations where the West can help and should help and has a moral duty to help, and to say that we shouldn't in those situations is also problematic. So like there's a slider there. We have to find the right balance, and it's going to involve a lot of asking these countries and their people what they want. In terms where there's autocratic regimes, it might mean bypassing the regime altogether, or bypassing international affairs and supporting NGOs, or might mean engaging more with things like fair trade and working with these countries in terms of finding approaches that support the goals that these countries have for themselves and these people have for themselves, as opposed to imposing Western values upon them.
Yeah, I think one issue there is because I think obviously Western countries have the resources to help African countries, and obviously we have the responsibility as well, since, as we've said, we're a large part of the problem. But I think when we see that we have the resources and the responsibility, we also sort of imagine that we have the authority on what should be done. Whereas I think just because we have the means to help African countries, that doesn't mean we're in charge of what's done to them. I think it's better to come. I think Western countries should come from an approach of listening to, say, I know there's an organization called Young African Leader Initiatives, different democratic activists in Africa. Obviously, they have the knowledge of what their country needs most, rather than us outsiders coming in saying, we know what's best for you. This is what we're going to install. I think we should come from the perspective of listening and just providing them what they need, rather than trying to, as you're saying, just like have like a sort of, there's like installing like our own values. It shouldn't just be your like European values in African countries. There obviously should be some like the democracy should be there, but it shouldn't be like a carbon copy of what we see here.
Yeah, like there's an interesting kind of manifestation of that, which is where like in the Sahel, France is very involved in providing military support to the African countries there to fight jihadists who don't really. It isn't a problem just for one country in Africa, and it isn't a problem just in Africa. It's a problem that affects European countries as well in terms of terrorism, and affects countries around the world in the Middle East, right? Where there's jihadists who are grouped in parts of the Sahel, and France, as a former colonial power there, there's nearly a perception that there's a moral duty upon them to go and provide help. And what happened, I can't remember when it was, I think it was sometime last year, not last year, but the year before, 2019, because as we know 2020 just didn't happen, but there was Macron essentially organised a conference, I can't remember where exactly it was, but he organised a conference and he got these African leaders to whom he was providing military support, and made it very clear to them that if at any point they didn't want the French military intervention or French military support in the Sahel in their countries, then that was, it was entirely their decision whether or not they were going to take on that kind of intervention, or not even intervention, but support from the West, which I think is it's a good way of looking at it. It's not something I'm entirely familiar with, but I think it shows the problem there. It's with, where like the West has the power and the resources to help, but it also needs to make sure that it's helping in a way that's actually helping, and not just appealing to our own sense of how we feel about what should be done in Africa.
Yeah, I think Ellen put it perfectly there. The West has, the West often feels like it has a duty because it has the power and resources. The West does have the ability to make a difference, and so a lot of the time we come to the conclusion of, oh, we have the ability to do something, so it's our duty to do something, and that often leads to imperialism. None of us like that. Really, I think what Macron did there, by the sounds of it, it sounds great. It sums it up perfectly, I think, in that the West does have the power and resources to help. So what's, the way forward is to give the option to African leaders. It is to present them an offer of help and ask them what we can do to help them. And this is a theme we've seen throughout the year with Black Lives Matter, especially. It has been, we need to listen to the voices of the people who are oppressed. We need to listen to the voices of the people who are going through struggles. Like, a big theme of Black Lives Matter has been just white people just shutting up and listening to their problems, because only after we listen, only after we know what their problems actually are, can we do anything to help. And which is why I think what Macron did there, but sounds it again, is great. We have the power and resources, so we should offer them. We have a duty, a moral duty, to offer our help to these countries. And really, we need to listen to leaders and take it from there. But then we've also run into problems in the past where the West very selectively chooses the leaders it wants to listen to and the leaders it doesn't want to listen to. And the leaders the West chooses to listen to often have very stereotypical Western liberal values, and they may not be the best leader fitted for their country. What I really think we need to focus on in the future is education. I'm not talking education like we have at the minute. I went to primary school and we were involved with a school in Uganda, actually, and we did fundraisers for them each year, and that was great. But what we were taught in primary school was, it doesn't sit right with me. It feels a little bit, off. It was just, all we were taught was that Africa, poor. We weren't taught about African, cultures. We weren't taught about different situations in different parts of Africa. We were just given Africa as a whole, as Oisin said earlier, and just said Africa, poor. And that's as absurd as, putting one generalization for all of Europe. It just can't be done. What I'd love to see in the future is, I'd love to see, especially in schools and colleges, speakers from African countries that are currently, experiencing high poverty rates, going through like living in autocracies, all the rest. I'd love to see those sorts of speakers come in and say like what the situation is in their country, what the situation has been in the past, what recent developments there have been, and just what we can do as the West to help and support them. What we can do as people and what our governments can do to help them. And that's actually something I should bring up with Sophia, because that could be a great speaker. And Ellen, I think that could be really interesting too for Polsock. But Ellen, what do you think are the best ways of, I know that's a very broad question, what are the best ways of educating people, but where are the platforms for us to give to speakers from these countries? Like, where should we really, to focus on? Is it in politics? Is it inviting people to speak to politicians, or is it inviting people to speak to primary schools and secondary schools and colleges, or a hybrid model? What do you think?
I think it's a big combination of everything, and it shouldn't just, and it's not even just about having these special events where speakers from African countries can come in to talk about politics or history. I think it should be fully like integrated into what we learn. So say some of us here do philosophy and we just learn Western philosophy, focusing on people like Plato and Socrates and just that kind of history. And even now, as we go further, like through the history of philosophy, it's all very focused on West and like what Western philosophers thought. So there is definitely, and because of all, and like that, you see that as well. And there's so many other examples of like the history we learn in primary and secondary school, like say science, geography, everything we learn. It's just like, it's definitely maintains that image that you were talking about, that is Africa is poor, and like you don't learn anything about the culture surrounding it other than it is poor and we should help them. So I think it props the West against Africa as like, oh, we're these benevolent people who are going to go help these poor people, when there is a vast history to African culture and politics that we just aren't being taught.
Yeah, like I think it is like, it still shocks me to think about it, like, and like, it's obvious because we all did the at least junior cert history, but like there's no junior cert history about Africa or Asia. Like I don't remember doing a single thing in the 3 years of junior cert history that took place in Africa or Asia. Like I think we might have done like a few lines in the Vietnam War and Korea, and that was about it, which is, it shows where
we got Korean War.
Yeah, because the Americans were in the Korean War, so we had to learn about that, But yeah, that's where, it has to start at curriculums as well. Like, and I know you can say that, like, for us, right, we're doing I know me, you and me, Ellen and Ryan, and are doing philosophy, and like we're doing history of Western philosophy first because that's the canon and that's what everyone learns first. And there's an element of that where it's like everyone learns in the West, everyone learns the Western philosophers first. So if you want to be involved in discussions with other universities, you have to learn the Western philosophers first. But that perpetuates that idea that Western philosophy is somehow more proper, and like the Eastern philosophy and philosophy from Africa, all that, it's kind of like it's something you do as like a side hobby, whereas like the main stuff happened in Greece 2,000 years ago, which I think a lot has to come down to curricula and like that very basic element of like, what do we actually teach in schools, and then obviously there's another aspect then of like education outside of schools and extracurricular education and so forth.
Yeah, that's I remember the loft in Letterkenny, going up to it a couple of times. I never went to it personally, whereas I regret this now, but they had a program going called Worldwide Voices, and that was done. It was done through Foróige, and I think that's the type of thing that needs to be focused on now. It seems to be the theme of 2020, and I hope it is the theme of 2021, and every year after that, it's listening to the oppressed people, and after that, simultaneously, learning about other cultures. I really wish that I could be more informed about the situation in many countries in Africa. I can be more informed, and that's on me. But I wish that that I knew more about African culture and Asian culture through learning it in school, and I didn't just learn about how the Celts made mud huts back in the day. Oisin, would you like to chat a bit about education and its role in all this?
Well, I don't really think I have a whole load. That's that how other than repeating what everyone else has said. There's the only reference to Africa in the junior cert I can remember was talking about the irrigation systems in the Nile. That's pretty much all I can remember. But I think it's very important to again like reflect on the effects of Western-centric education. Right now, we have a serious problem. We're living through a pandemic, and while we in the West are lucky enough to be getting all of the vaccines now, at the moment, people in Africa don't have the same luck. And I suppose luck maybe probably isn't the right phrase. It's an intentional choice. The fact that pharmaceutical companies are prioritizing profit over the well-being of other people, and it's one thing to deny them access to vaccines, because they don't have the same buying power as countries in the West. But it's more detrimental to the world as a whole. We've seen variants and mutations of the vaccine of the virus rather develop and become serious problems in recent months. And so long as there is an unequal distribution of the vaccines, as Europe and the United States, in the Western world, and Russia have developed their own, and China have developed their own, and they're vaccinating themselves first and foremost. Not only are people in Africa suffering even more than the rest of the world, but the rest of the world is going to end up suffering more as a whole as mutations of the virus develop. And in fairness, we've seen China, I was reading in the past couple of days, I think they're sending, I can't remember, I want to say 100 million vaccines to Africa. Of their I think they have 3 or 4 vaccines developed in China. I can't remember exactly what sort of efficacy they're reporting, or if they've released those numbers. But they've plans to send their vaccine to Africa. But we also have to be very careful as well in understanding why any country gives, I say help, but in air quotes help, because while, I would gladly accept that China are doing that because they understand the health implications, but between direct and indirect aid, the United States, the EU, and over the past 20 years, China have been exerting hegemony, mostly through financial means across Africa. Particularly Eurobond areas, the loans that have been offered to Africa, they only care about profit. They're not caring about how the money that they're sending to Africa is affecting living outcomes of people there. So hopefully, we can see IP patents removed from the vaccine the same way that was done in the middle of the 20th century with the likes of polio, because otherwise not only is Africa going to suffer even more than it already has, it's going to suffer even more, and as always, it's going to be the fault of the West.
It really does seem... Oh, no, sorry.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting I think it's interesting that when Oisin brought up China helping African countries with vaccines, I was a citizen in one of these impoverished countries, and I saw one global superpower helping my country. I would definitely feel more affiliated towards them and towards the values that they're offering me, rather than these Western countries that keep talking about their own values while offering nothing. And then that would definitely work more to even to eroding democracy even further in African countries if say China starts working more with them, and offering things to them, like you're saying, this aid probably could come with some ulterior motives beyond just helping people. It could be part of installing like different values and ideals that are all like democracy that's already eroding in Africa.
Yeah, I think you're perfect. I'm glad, Oisin, that you brought up China there, because it's been missing from the conversation so far. That you can't, like, as you're saying on, like, you can't talk about, you know, what Western policy and foreign policy should be with regards to development without chatting about what Chinese policy is. And while, you know, like, there is like an element of it there where, like, China does do a lot to help and develop African countries, but there's issues there as well with how they do it. Just the same way there's issues with the way the West does it, and that, like, China has a very strict policy of non-interference when it comes to domestic affairs, which and it makes sense. You know, like, China wouldn't be considered a democratic country, really. And if we're chatting about democratization, China's probably not going to be a big fan of that, or it's not going to insist on it anyway. It's not going to use its bargaining power to force democratization when it doesn't value democratization itself. So if you, yeah, essentially, like, if you're an autocratic leader and, you know, you're looking at the West, who, even if the West got their act together and offered a proper, a good deal about, in exchange for some reforms, we'll give you a certain amount of aid, and, like, it was a great policy or whatever, right? If you were looking at that, and then as an autocratic leader, then you were also looking at China, who's offering just the same aid or maybe even more, with no requirements to reform, or no other conditions attached to it about the welfare of your citizens or anything like that, then obviously you would go with China. And that makes the whole situation a lot more complex, and I honestly don't know enough about it to to chat about it really, but it's obviously we can't discuss how foreign policy should treat Africa, and how we should support democratization in Africa without looking at the effect that China has on it as well.
Does anyone want to weigh in more on China's effects on democratization in Africa, or their role in it, or will we move on to my next point? I'll take that as I will move on to the next point. Oisin, what I thought was brilliant that you brought up earlier, we touched on it a little bit, was climate change. We're living in the middle of the worst pandemic in anyone's living memory, at least I believe. And it's clear that third world countries are going to be impacted the worst from this pandemic. Like, the West are now getting the vaccines, the cavalry's on its way, all that. Third world countries do not have the same sort of hope. And what Oisin mentioned earlier was that our real interests, if we want to help people living in poverty, especially in African countries, is to prevent climate change. It's clear that, you know, the poor were hit the worst by the coronavirus, and the poor will be hit the worst by climate change. That's a known fact. It's things keep going the way they're going. It'll almost be I'm not going to use that term. Sorry, it'll a mass murder of the poor if we allow climate change to continue in the way it's going. And Oisin, I just want to know, do you want to chat just a little bit about climate change and what Ireland, just really quickly, on what you think Ireland's main focuses for preventing climate change should be right now? Just want to hear it.
Well, anything would be a good start. I know that towards the end of last year, under the new government, the Climate Action Plan was released, and it's the fact that the Green Party have their names on that they call themselves a Green Party, and I'm not saying, you know, it's exclusively a Green problem. It's been the parties who've been in government for as long as we've known that climate change was an issue. There's been no ambition in Ireland to, certainly from our governments, to have any real impact on the way in which we try and mitigate climate change. Through the last government, Ireland were continuously at the bottom of the rate in which we were reducing our carbon emissions in the entire EU, and obviously in terms of GDP per capita, and it shows how ineffective these kind of econometrics are. But when Ireland is widely considered one of the most affluent countries financially, economically in the European Union, that we're so bad at having initiatives that mitigate our emissions and that sort of thing. It's a disgrace and nothing less. I think our goal from the new climate action plan is carbon neutrality by 2050. That's depending on what climate scientist you ask, that's between 10 and 20 years too late. So complete overhaul and just having a genuine look at how we haven't prioritized climate change in any of our policies in the 21st century. We really have to have another look and say that and realize that climate change is the single biggest issue that we are ever going to face, and if we don't face up to it now, it's going to be too late. So that involves, a complete redrawing of the climate action plan. Maybe the ways in which we get there might be, sort of similar actions but accelerated. And I think that by prioritizing climate action as one of the most important things that our leaders can do, that's the primary way in which we can actually make real positive climate action.
Yeah,
That's brilliant. Sorry, Evan, I'm gonna have to cut off the speakers now. Oisin, that was brilliant. I do think that climate action needs to be at the forefront of policy now, and that is where, just especially in voting, where we need to be voting. But just to finish off, to summarize, I think we've come to the conclusion that what the West's role in developing democracy in third world countries that are experiencing autocratic regimes is to offer their help. They don't have a duty to impose their help. They don't have an authority to impose their help or to impose, their values. But we do have a duty to offer our help. And the best things that we can do in our own country then appear to be education, educating people around not only of our cultures, but where was I going with that? Not only around our cultures, but about climate change as well, and about what we can do to help. Sorry, I lost my track there. But education and climate change policy seem to be the best way. Seem to be what the West should focus on currently in developing democracy in African countries. I'd really like to thank Evan Karen Key, Alan Kenny, and Oisin Brown. Go follow them on Instagram. As you can tell, they were all great speakers. A lot better than I was anyway. But thank you all very much. And I think we'll call it there if you all want to say goodbye. Thank you all for listening also. I really appreciate it. Bye.
Thanks, Ryan.
Bye.